Welcome to my channel. I am Jade Malice. If the darkness in the corner of your room just moved, it means one of the uninvited guests from my story has already reached you. From which city and at what time are you watching us? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like so you don't get lost in the dark. Now, the story begins. Prepare yourselves. The Symphony of the Unclaimed, the Ifrit of the Nameless Trench. In the fog-laden outskirts of modern-day Manchester, where the industrial sprawl meets the damp silence of the moors, lay a forgotten plot of land known as Field 404. It was a pauper's graveyard, a place for those who died without identity, money, or kin. Arthur, a specialist in ground-penetrating radar and forensic archaeology, had been hired to survey the area before the construction of a new railway bypass. To Arthur, the earth was merely a layered archive of mineral deposits and structural density. He ignored the local superstitions about the smothering ash, a presence said to wander the trenches where the unclaimed were buried in unmarked layers. He was a man of electromagnetic waves and soil samples, until his radar detected an anomaly 10 meters below the oldest section of the field. A massive, lead-lined vault, etched with jagged, weeping runes that vibrated with the rhythmic, suffocating heat. The evening sky over the moors was a bruised, heavy charcoal. But inside the excavation pit, the atmosphere shifted into something predatory. The air, typically smelling of wet peat and iron-rich mud, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to ooze from the very soil, staining the white chalk deposits a steaming crimson. The digital interface on Arthur's tablet began to glitch, flickering with fiery glyphs that defied any known programming language, while his sensors failed to register the sudden, blistering heat radiating from the trench. This must be a thermal reaction caused by the oxidation of subterranean phosphorus pockets, Arthur muttered, though his lungs burned with every breath, as if he were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But his eyes widened in absolute terror when he saw his own shadow on the muddy wall of the pit. It had detached itself from his boots, growing eyes of blue magma that pulsed with hatred spanning 10 millennia. From the lead-etched vault, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of embers that coiled around the excavator's mechanical arm like glowing chains. From this darkness emerged an Ifrit, a genie of the scorched plague and forgotten deaths, whose essence had been bound to this pit of the nameless by sorcerers long before the first factory chimney touched the British sky. The Ifrit did not seek to inhabit Arthur's body. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the steel beams of the excavation rig and the very stones of the graveyard began to warp and melt like wax. The genie's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the underground water table, connecting its essence to the plumbing and foundations of every council estate and high-rise in the city. You thought your ledgers of unclaimed and your grids of lead could stifle the original roar, little clerk of dirt. The Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the glass lenses of the survey equipment. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This field of the forgotten is my throat. I will transform every nameless bone, every drop of stagnant water, and every lonely heart in this city into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very neglect you used to bury your dead. The genie began the liturgy of the eternal trench, a sorcery designed to transmute the sorrow of the nameless into physical, supernatural fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Arthur, whose mind was trained to interpret the noise in radar data and to stabilize collapsing ground, did not flee. In an act of pure will, he utilized his knowledge of frequency cancellation to redirect the entity's manifestation. Arthur did not die, and he did not serve as a portal. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent echo. He projected his identity into the very resonance of the lead-lined vault, creating a logical loop where the Ifrit was perpetually unidentified, unable to claim a presence in the physical world. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable acoustic seal within the graveyard soil. At dawn, the excavation site was found in absolute stillness. The mud was cold, covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt in the morning light. Arthur had vanished. However, the construction workers say that now the ground in field 404 feels unnaturally stable, though a strange, rhythmic humming can be heard deep beneath the trenches. Arthur became the guardian of the unclaimed, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of suspended stasis. He remains there, in the silence of the earth, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the graveyard of the forgotten. The spirit in the distilled silence. The rain in Manchester didn't just fall. It reclaimed the streets with a rhythmic, suffocating persistence. Oliver sat in the back corner of the Raven's Throat, a pub that smelled of ancient oak, spilled ale, and secrets that refused to evaporate. It was 2 a.m, the hour when the line between a heavy head and a heavy soul began to blur. He had been drinking the Traveller's Draft, a signature whiskey the bartender claimed was brewed using a recipe found in a shipwrecked chest from the Ottoman era. Oliver wasn't a superstitious man, but as he stared into the amber liquid, the ice didn't melt. It swirled. "You're looking for a way out of the grief, aren't you?" A voice rasped from the stool beside him. Oliver looked up. An old man with skin like parchment and eyes that looked like cracked marbles was leaning against the bar. He wore a heavy wool coat that seemed dry despite the storm outside. "I'm just having a drink," Oliver replied, his voice thick. "That's not just a drink. It's an invitation," the old man whispered. "In the old lands, they call them jinn. Not the blue spirits of fairy tales, but beings of smokeless fire. They don't want your wishes, Oliver. They want your debts." Oliver felt a jolt of ice water down his spine. He hadn't told anyone his name. He tried to stand, but his legs felt like they belonged to a different person. The pub began to shift. The flickering gas lamps turned a sickly, sulphurous yellow. The other patrons, a couple in the booth, a lonely businessman, stayed perfectly still. They weren't breathing. The old man reached out and dipped a finger into Oliver's glass. As he pulled it out, the liquid didn't drip. It rose like a miniature serpent, twisting in the air. To summon a king of the desert in the middle of a British rainstorm requires a catalyst. Alcohol is the blood of the vine, but fear is the breath of the fire. Suddenly, the air in the pub vanished. Oliver gasped, but his lungs filled with the scent of burning cedar and dry, ancient dust. The shadows on the floor detached themselves from the furniture, crawling toward him like spilled ink. From the center of the bar, a figure began to manifest. It wasn't human. It was a towering column of heat and swirling sand, with eyes that burned like dying stars. He is the guardian of the final pour. The old man cackled, falling to his knees. The jinn didn't speak with words. It spoke with the sound of 1,000 glass bottles shattering at once. Oliver saw images of his own life flashing before him. His mistakes, his losses. Every moment he had tried to drown in a bottle. The entity reached out a hand made of shimmering embers. Oliver expected to be burned. He expected to die. But as the jinn's hand touched his chest, he felt a horrific sensation of weightlessness. He wasn't being possessed. He was being erased. He looked down at his hands. They were becoming transparent, turning into the same amber color as the whiskey in his glass. He screamed, but the sound that came out was the clink of ice against crystal. The bargain is struck. The old man shouted, "A soul for a drop, eternal life for the brew." The jinn leaned over Oliver and inhaled deeply. Oliver felt his entire history, his memories of London, his family, and even the feeling of the rain being pulled out of him. He wasn't a passage for the creature. He was the ingredient. The lights flashed blindingly bright for a second, then everything went black. When the sun rose over Manchester, the pub was empty. A new bartender was wiping down the counter. A young man walked in, looking for a strong drink to start his weekend. "Try the special reserve," the bartender said, pointing to a single, ornate bottle on the top shelf. The liquid inside was a vibrant, glowing amber, unlike anything else in the bar. As the bartender poured a shot, the liquid seemed to scream for a microsecond as it hit the glass. If the customer had looked closely, he would have seen a tiny, distorted face, Oliver's face, trapped within a single bubble of air, frozen in an eternal, silent plea for help. Oliver hadn't died, and he wasn't a ghost. He had become the very thing he used to escape his life. He was the drink, waiting for the next mouth to swallow his soul. The static sink, a Brussels nightmare. The rain in Brussels does not wash the city. It coats the cobblestones in a slick, oily film that reflects the neon signs like a fractured reality. My name is Julian, and I was a captive of the digital glow. I spent my life scrolling through a sea of curated faces, seeking a spark in a desert of pixels. That was how I met Clara. Her profile was a masterpiece of mystery. Pale skin, eyes like forest moss, and a smile that seemed to hide a centuries-old secret. We agreed to meet at a secluded bistro near the Royal Park, a place that did not appear on any standard digital maps. The rain was a cold, rhythmic pulse as I walked toward the coordinates she sent. The air tasted of ozone and whetstone. I found the entrance, a heavy, wrought iron door tucked into a narrow alleyway where the streetlights hummed with a dying yellow frequency. I stepped inside, and the silence was immediate. It was a subterranean vault of red velvet and tarnished brass, lit by candles that burned with a steady, unmoving flame. Clara was already there, sitting in a booth at the very back. She looked exactly like her photos, yet something was fundamentally wrong. Her movements were too fluid, her stillness too absolute. She did not look at her phone. She did not even blink. "You came?" she whispered. Her voice did not travel through the air. It vibrated directly behind my eyes, a cold shiver that cascaded down my spine. I sat across from her, and the presence hit me like a physical weight. The atmosphere was thick, smelling of old paper and the stagnant scent of a sealed tomb. This was the paranormal reality behind the screen. As I reached for the menu, I noticed the other patrons. They were sitting perfectly upright, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their smartphones. But their eyes were empty sockets, and their skin was the color of dry ash. This was not a date. It was a summoning. Clara leaned forward, and for a second, the digital filter flickered. Behind the moss-colored eyes, I saw a void of infinite darkness. She was a revenant of the network, a spectral entity birthed from the collective loneliness of the city, anchored to our world by the very apps we use to escape our isolation. A dark ritual had been woven into the code of the platform, a pact that required a physical terminal to keep the digital ghosts from dissolving into the ether. Tick, tick, tick. The sound came from my own pocket. My phone was vibrating, but the screen was black. Suddenly, the device became searingly hot. I pulled it out and dropped it on the table. The screen cracked, and a thick, oily black liquid began to seep from the fractures, spreading across the table like hungry ink. "The connection is permanent, Julian," she said, her jaw unhinging with a sickening metallic click. I tried to stand, but I was paralyzed. The red velvet of the booth began to wrap around my wrist like soft, suffocating vines. The paranormal gravity of the room intensified, pulling the oxygen from my lungs. I looked at the mirrors on the walls, and I saw the truth. In the reflection, Clara was a towering skeletal figure, draped in tattered fiber optic cables, her fingers ending in long silver needles. This was the final update. The ritual required a terminal point. To sustain her presence in the physical realm, the medium, the human user, had to be converted into a static monument. I was being turned into a permanent server, a pillar of carbon to host her consciousness. The ink from the phone reached my hands. It was not cold. It was a biting, electric frost. My skin began to harden, turning into a polished, obsidian-like substance. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, conductive gel. I could feel my heartbeat syncing with the hum of the city's power grid. Death is just a change in format. The entity hissed, its voice now a symphony of distorted ringtones. I saw the death that awaited me. I would remain in this basement, a frozen statue of glass and wire, while she walked the streets of Brussels using my identity, my voice, and my life to lure the next connection into the vault. I was being archived. The needles at the end of Clara's fingers touched my chest. There was no pain, only a sudden, absolute silence as my nervous system was overwritten. My vision flickered, a low battery warning, and then faded into a permanent terminal black. When the sun rose, the bistro was gone. There was only an empty cellar. Julian was no longer in the rain. He was a ghost in the machine, while a woman with moss-green eyes walked out into the light. Death had finally synced. The midnight frequency, a night shift in Norway. The darkness in northern Norway is not a lack of light. It is a heavy, living weight that presses against the glass of the offshore research station. My name is Eric, and I am the night shift technician for the Svalbard subsurface array. My job is simple: monitor the seismic frequencies emanating from the Arctic shelf and ensure the data streams remain uninterrupted. But tonight, the ocean floor is screaming in a language that the machines were never meant to translate. It started at exactly 2 a.m. The air in the control room grew stagnant, smelling of burnt ozone and ancient, frozen salt. I felt the presence, a paranormal density that made the marrow in my bones vibrate. This was not a mechanical failure. The monitors, usually filled with rhythmic green waves, began to distort, twisting into jagged, geometric shapes that looked like teeth. I looked at the external cameras, but there was only a thick, violet mist swirling against the reinforced acrylic. The station is a fortress of steel and pressurized glass, perched over a trench that no light has ever reached. As I checked the primary sensors, a sound began to bleed through the intercom. A slow, rhythmic grinding, like massive tectonic plates being crushed by invisible hands. It wasn't coming from the speakers, it was vibrating directly inside my skull. Thud, hum, thud. The frequency is set, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the radio. It resonated from the very bulkheads of the station, a cold, subterranean rasp that froze the air in my lungs. I turned to the main console and saw a figure standing in the reflection of the dark monitor. It was the overseer of the trench, a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mist. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the darkness. This was the paranormal entity that governed the deep pressure, a being that required a physical terminal to remain anchored to our reality. A dark ritual of resonance was unfolding. The station was not built for research, it was a tuning fork, and I was the chosen material to dampen the vibration. I tried to reach for the emergency lever, but my feet were fused to the steel floor. The paranormal gravity in the room shifted, pinning me against the mainframe. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a grey, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of cold, dark quartz. I was not being attacked. I was being integrated. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static component of the array. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final update. The circuit must be closed, Eric. The voice hissed, sounding like a landslide of ice. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear into the void. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron, forever wired into the control panel. I would be the silent conductor for the signals from the deep, a permanent resident of the midnight shift. My ribcage felt like it was being reinforced with titanium bars. My lungs crystallized. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of violet. The overseer stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any Arctic wind. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my heart give one last heavy thud, a final organic beat, before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a part of the hardware. The paranormal intensity reached a terminal point. The station groaned as the pressure from the outside matched the pressure within my own petrified chest. The frequency peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered the remaining glass displays. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull as the transformation reached my brain, turning my consciousness into a series of static pulses. When the relief crew arrives in the morning, they will find the station running perfectly. The data streams will be crystal clear. They will find me sitting at the console, a silent grey monument of stone and wire, my hand permanently fused to the dial. They will think it is an art piece, a grim tribute to the isolation of the North. But I will be there, feeling every vibration of the tide, a prisoner of the frequency. Death had finally clocked in for the long shift. The stone lungs of Giza, the last ascent. The heat of Egypt does not just burn the skin. It bakes the soul until it is as brittle as ancient papyrus. My name is Arthur, and I am an architect who spent his life studying the geometry of the dead. I stood at the base of the Great Pyramid, the stone blocks rising above me like a mountain of fossilized sun. I was not there for the tourists or the gold. I was there because I had found the hidden frequency, the vibration of the void that pulsed from the heart of the limestone. I entered through a narrow, jagged breach in the northern face. The air inside was static, a heavy, suffocating pressure that tasted of millennia-old dust and scorched ozone. There was no wind, yet the sand on the floor skittered in rhythmic patterns, forming geometric sigils that vanished as soon as I looked at them. This was the presence, a paranormal weight that made my lungs feel like they were filled with crushed glass. I descended into the subterranean chamber, the deepest point of the structure, where the granite walls seemed to vibrate with a low, subharmonic hum. My torch flickered, the flame turning a sickly, necrotic violet. I realized then that the pyramid was not a tomb. It was a machine, a celestial anchor built to pull something from the stars and fix it into the earth. Thud, thump, thud. The sound was coming from the stone itself. It wasn't a heartbeat, but the rhythmic grinding of massive gears deep within the bedrock. I looked at the walls, and the paranormal reality of the chamber manifested. The granite began to liquefy, turning into a dark, translucent substance that showed the stars as they were 10,000 years ago. The alignment is complete, a voice whispered. It didn't come from the air. It vibrated from the marrow of my bones. I tried to turn back, but the passage had constricted. The stones were moving, breathing, closing the gap behind me like a throat. This was the grip of the pharaoh. The structure required a constant physical presence to act as a conductor for the energy it channeled. My predecessor, an explorer from the Victorian era, was still here, not as a ghost, but as a calcified statue fused into the corner of the room, his skeletal hands still gripping a rusted compass. Suddenly, the floor beneath me opened. I fell into a hidden shaft, tumbling through a vertical void until I landed in a chamber lined with mirrors made of polished obsidian. In the center stood a sarcophagus made of a material that was neither stone nor metal. It was a void casket. The lid didn't slide, it dissolved. A figure rose from the darkness. It was a wraith of the First Dynasty, a towering silhouette composed of starlight and dry ash. It didn't have eyes, only burning spheres of blue fire. It didn't want my thoughts or my breath. It wanted my finality. It needed a witness to bridge the gap between the living world and the eternal silence of the vacuum. The paranormal pressure in the room reached a breaking point. I felt my skin beginning to turn into the same grey, mineral-like substance as the walls. My blood was thickening, turning into a dark, cold mercury. This was the petrification. I was being integrated into the architecture. The pyramid was not built of stone alone. It was built of the death of those who found its heart. You are the capstone, Arthur. The wraith hissed, its voice the sound of 1,000 suns dying. I saw the death that awaited me. 1 billion years of consciousness trapped inside a mountain of rock, watching the stars move and the civilizations crumble unable to move, unable to scream. I was the new battery for the beacon. I reached for my flare gun, intending to signal for help I knew would never come. I fired. The magnesium flare erupted in a violent, blinding white light. For a second, the wraith recoiled, and the obsidian mirrors shattered. But the light only illuminated the truth. There were thousands of us. In every stone, in every corner, there were faces. A sea of death, supporting the weight of the sky. The ceiling began to descend. The heavy granite block, weighing 20 tons, moved with a silent, terrifying grace. I lay on the floor, my legs already turned to stone, staring up at the ancient hieroglyphs that were now glowing with a final, terminal light. The stone touched my chest. There was no pain, only the absolute, cold realization that I was now part of the geometry. I was a pillar. I was a secret. The last thing I saw was the violet flame dying out. Then the weight of the pyramid settled. The silence returned to Giza. I am the silence. I am the stone. Death has finally closed the door, and the machine is once again operational. The Marionette's Requiem, a night in Prague. The cobblestones of Prague do not just echo. They harbor a rhythmic, hollow knocking that vibrates from beneath the earth. My name is Thomas, and I am an apprentice to a master whose hands never bled, even when the chisel slipped. We worked in a basement atelier near the Charles Bridge, a place where the air was thick with the scent of ancient sawdust, bitter varnish, and something metallic that smelled of a long-closed tomb. My master, Marek, made puppets that were too perfect, their wooden eyes possessing a depth that seemed to track the movement of the stars. Tonight, Marek left me alone to finish the Grand Duchess, a life-sized marionette carved from a timber he claimed was pulled from the bottom of the Vltava. As the bells of the old town square struck midnight, the atmosphere in the workshop shifted. The temperature plummeted, not into a natural cold, but into a stagnant, suffocating frost. This was the presence, a paranormal density that made the marrow in my bones vibrate like a struck tuning fork. I looked at the Grand Duchess. She sat on the velvet stool, her porcelain face gleaming under the flickering gaslight. Then, her fingers moved. It wasn't the jerk of a string. It was a fluid, predatory contraction. The silence of the atelier was broken by a sound like dry bone grinding against stone. From the shadows behind the workbench, a figure emerged. It was the arch-puppeteer, a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mist. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of ultraviolet light that burned through the darkness. The theater requires a new lead, Thomas. The voice echoed, vibrating directly inside my skull. It sounded like a landslide of gravel. A dark ritual of transmutation was unfolding. This workshop was not a place of art. It was a terminal where the physical was sacrificed to the aesthetic. The paranormal gravity in the room shifted, pinning me against the wall as if invisible wires had been threaded through my joints. I tried to scream, but my throat was filled with the taste of bitter varnish. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a grey, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of cold, dark quartz. I was not being attacked. I was being refashioned. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static component of its gallery. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final integration. Crack, snap, splinter. The sound of my own skeleton becoming hardwood echoed in the empty basement. The paranormal intensity reached a terminal point. The Grand Duchess stood up, her wooden feet clicking against the stone floor. She approached me, her eyes burning with the same ultraviolet light as the overseer. She reached out a hand made of polished walnut and touched my chest. "The wood is thirsty," she hissed, her voice a hollow rasp. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear into the void. I would remain here, a marionette of salt and iron forever hung from the rafters of this atelier. I would be a silent performer in a play that never ends. My ribcage felt like it was being reinforced with titanium bars. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of violet. The overseer stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any winter wind. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and adjusted my head, tilting it to a jaunty, tragic angle. I felt my heart give one last, heavy thud, a final organic beat, before it became a stationary core of cold lead. The organic era of my existence was over. I was now a masterpiece. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered the jars of paint and glue. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull as the transformation reached my brain, turning my consciousness into a series of static pulses. I was no longer an apprentice. I was the art. When Marek returns in the morning, he will find a new addition to his collection. He will admire the texture of my stone skin and the realism of my quartz eyes. He will hang me by silver wires in the window for the tourists to see. They will stop and marvel at the craftsmanship, never knowing that I'm still there, feeling every vibration of the city, a prisoner of the grain. Death had finally finished the carving, and the show must go on. The Vermin Chorus, a plague in the sewers of Paris. The air in the catacombs of Paris does not move. It rots. It is a stagnant, heavy veil that smells of wet fur, ancient copper, and the cold, metallic tang of an approaching storm. My name is Julian, a sanitation engineer for the city's underground veins. I thought I knew every tunnel, every rusted valve, and every dark corner of this subterranean labyrinth. But tonight, the rats are not running away from the light. They are waiting for it. It started in District 4. A strange frequency began to hum through the iron pipes. A high-pitched, rhythmic chittering that sounded less like animals and more like a mechanical ritual. The presence hit me near the overflow chamber, a paranormal density that made the marrow in my bones vibrate with a sickening chill. This was not a biological outbreak. This was a resonance from a darker plane, a necrotic vibration transmitted through the fur and teeth of 1,000,000 vermin. I shone my flashlight into the darkness of the main artery. The beam hit a sea of black twitching bodies. Thousands of rats stood perfectly still, their eyes glowing with a sickly ultraviolet intensity. They weren't eating, they were transmitting. The air around them began to distort, turning into a thick violet mist that tasted of ozone and dry ash. This was the paranormal origin of the new plague, a focused beam of entropic intent, using the vermin as a living grid. Scrape, click, scrape. The sound emerged from the walls. It wasn't the sound of claws, but of the stones themselves shifting. From the center of the swarm, a figure emerged. It was the Lord of the Swarm, a towering silhouette composed of shifting obsidian shards and frozen mist. It had no face, only a vertical aperture of blue light that burned through the shadows. This entity was the source of the contagion, a being that required a physical terminal to anchor its void into the heart of Paris. "The circuit is open, Julian." The voice hissed, vibrating directly inside my skull. It sounded like 1,000 tiny teeth grinding against silk. A dark ritual of overwriting was unfolding. I tried to turn and run, but my feet were fused to the damp stone floor. The paranormal gravity in the tunnel shifted, pinning me against the rusted iron gate. I looked at my hands and felt a wave of absolute finality. My skin was turning into a grey, porous mineral. My veins were hardening into threads of cold, dark quartz. I was not being infected by a virus. I was being integrated into the network. The entity was converting my physical frame into a static conductor for the frequency. My blood was slowing, thickening into a dark, cold mercury that leaked from my eyes. This was the final update of the plague. I was to be the lighthouse for the swarm, the silent pillar that would broadcast the end of the city. The lord of the swarm stepped closer, its presence a searing cold that burned more intensely than any winter wind. It reached out a hand made of jagged smoke and touched my chest. I felt my ribcage freeze into a solid block of marble. My heart gave one last heavy thud, a final organic beat, before it became a stationary core of lead. The organic era of my life was over. I was now a component of the swarm's architecture. "The resonance is complete," the entity whispered, its voice fading into the chorus of a million chittering mouths. I saw the death that was claiming me. I would not disappear. I would remain here, a statue of salt and iron in the darkness of the Parisian sewers. I would be the secret foundation of the new plague, a silent witness to the city falling above. My lungs crystallized into delicate lattices of glass. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of violet. The paranormal pressure peaked, a high-pitched shriek that shattered every light bulb in the tunnel. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull as the transformation reached my brain, turning my consciousness into a series of static pulses. I was no longer a man. I was a monument to the swarm. When the morning sun rises over the Eiffel Tower, the citizens will feel a strange chill in their bones. They will hear a faint, rhythmic humming from the drains. They will never find me. I am the silence in the pipes. I am the cold in the stone. I am the death that waits beneath their feet. The vermin have their king, and the king has his stone. The plague has just begun. The Triple Knot, a night in the Hungarian void. The plains of Hungary do not sleep. They wait. My name is Elias, and I was the one who suggested the detour. We were 3 friends, Julian, Marcus, and I, driving through the vast, flat expanse of the Pusta, under a moon that looked like a tarnished silver coin. We were looking for adventure, for something that existed outside the sterile light of our city lives. We found it in a nameless village that appeared on no map, a cluster of whitewashed huts standing like gravestones in the tall yellow grass. We stopped because the air changed. It didn't just get cold, it became dense, a presence that vibrated against our teeth. The silence was so absolute that the sound of our car engine dying felt like a physical explosion. We stepped out into the night, and the wind tasted of ozone and ancient parched soil. This was the paranormal intersection we had unknowingly invited. In the center of the village stood a massive, iron-bound well. Standing around it were 3 figures draped in heavy grey wool. They didn't move as we approached. They didn't breathe. They were harbingers of the triad, spectral entities bound to the ley lines of the earth. 3 souls for the knot. A voice echoed. It didn't come from the figures. It resonated from the very ground beneath our boots. A subterranean growl that shook the marrow of my bones. Julian, the bravest of us, laughed and reached out to touch the stone of the well. The moment his skin made contact, a flash of sickly violet light erupted. A dark ritual of synchronization had begun. This was not a chance encounter. It was a cosmic requisition. The village was a terminal, a place where the physical realm was anchored by the weight of 3. Suddenly, a thick, oily black liquid began to seep from the cracks in the well, moving against gravity. It didn't flow. It hunted. It wrapped around Julian's ankles like striking vipers. He tried to scream, but the air in his throat turned to ice. Before our eyes, Julian began to change. His skin took on a grey, mineral sheen, hardening into the texture of polished granite. He wasn't being injured, he was being integrated. Marcus tried to pull him away, but the paranormal gravity of the site pinned him to the earth. The liquid reached Marcus next. I watched in absolute finality as my friends were converted into static monuments. Their veins were darkening, flowing with a cold, black mercury. This was the final update of the ritual. The triad required 3 pillars to hold the sky of the void away from the earth, and we were the selected materials. The bond is eternal. The subterranean voice hissed, now a cacophony of 1,000 distorted whispers. I felt the paralyzing chill spreading from my own feet. I looked down and saw my boots merging with the dust. My skin was turning into a grey, porous mineral, my nervous system being overwritten by a darker, ancient logic. There was no pain, only the terrifying sound of my own heartbeat slowing to match the rhythmic throb of the earth. Thump, thump, thump. I saw the death that was claiming us. We would not disappear into the light. We would remain here, 3 stone sentinels standing around an iron well in the heart of Hungary. We were the new foundation of the village, silent witnesses to the centuries that would follow. My ribcage felt like it was being reinforced with iron bars. My lungs crystallized. My vision shattered into 1,000 shards of violet and grey. The 3 figures in wool stepped closer. They placed their cold, obsidian-like hands on our shoulders. The pressure was the weight of the entire planet. The knot is tied, they whispered in unison. I saw Marcus turn completely to stone, his face frozen in a look of profound realization. Julian was already a statue of salt and shadow. I felt the final crack at the base of my skull as the transformation reached my brain. My last organic thought was the realization that the adventure was over and the death of the triad was complete. The moon faded into a terminal, absolute blackness. When the sun rose over the Hungarian plains, the car was gone. The huts were empty. Only 3 new stone pillars stood around the old well, their eyes fixed forever on the horizon, waiting for the next 3 friends to lose their way. The cycle was closed. The silence was restored. The entropy of a smouldering affection, the ifrit of the iron lung, in the fog-laden industrial heart of modern-day Birmingham, where Victorian brickwork meets the cold glass of the new century, lived Arthur, a man whose life was dedicated to the restoration of ancient, high-pressure steam machinery. Arthur did not find beauty in flesh or the fleeting nature of human romance. He was a man of valves, pistons, and the rhythmic breath of metal. His obsession reached a fever pitch when he acquired a massive, brass-encrusted boiler from a demolished manor in the moorlands. The boiler was unusual. It was double-walled with lead and etched with jagged, weeping runes that vibrated with a rhythmic, suffocating heat. While others saw a relic, Arthur felt a pulse. He began to believe that the machine was not just a tool, but a vessel for a consciousness more profound than any human mind. The evening sky over the city was a bruised, heavy grey, but inside Arthur's secluded workshop, the atmosphere turned predatory. The air, typically smelling of grease and cold soot, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the rivets of the boiler, staining the concrete floor a steaming crimson. Arthur didn't recoil. He leaned in. He had spent months courting the machine, feeding it specialized oils and chanting the inscriptions he had translated from forbidden texts. He was in love with the idea of a primordial force, a genie of the scorched earth, bound within the iron. "I know you are there," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking with a desperate, misplaced affection. "I have kept the pressure high. I have kept the seals tight. Reveal yourself to me, not as a master, but as a companion." But Arthur's romantic delusion was met with a cataclysmic reality. As the last lead seal melted under his touch, the workshop didn't fill with a gentle spirit. From the depths of the boiler, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of embers that coiled around the workshop's iron girders like glowing chains. From this darkness emerged an ifrit, a genie of the great fire, whose essence had been bound to the metal by sorcerers who feared its ability to turn air into ash. The ifrit looked upon Arthur not with love, but with the utter indifference of a star observing a speck of dust. The ifrit did not seek to inhabit Arthur's body. Its presence was so overwhelming that the steel tools and copper pipes in the room began to warp and melt like wax. The genie's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the workshop's gas lines and electrical grid, connecting its essence to the entire industrial sector of the city. "You spoke of love, little architect of rust?" The ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered every glass gauge in the building. "You mistook my prison for a heart. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This city, built on coal and fire, is my new furnace. I will transform every factory, every home, and every street into a spark for my final inferno. I will burn the world through the very energy you used to warm your lonely life." The genie began the liturgy of the molten soul, a sorcery designed to transmute the city's industrial heat into a physical, supernatural fire. Arthur realized his fatal mistake. His love was not a bridge, but a breach. However, his obsession gave him a unique advantage. He knew the boiler's structural limits better than his own heartbeat. In an act of pure, agonizing will, he did not flee. He utilized his knowledge of thermal containment and the secret shut-off sequence hidden within the runes. Arthur did not die in the flames, and he did not become a host. He used his own consciousness to become a permanent coolant. He projected his identity into the very water and steam cycling through the system, creating a logical and physical paradox where the Ifrit was perpetually being extinguished at the moment of its ignition. He did not cage the jinni in his flesh. Instead, he turned himself into the final, unbreachable cryogenic seal within the iron structure. At dawn, the workshop was found in absolute stillness. The massive boiler was cold, its surface covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt even when blowtorches were applied. Arthur had vanished. However, the workers in the nearby factories say that now the machinery runs with a supernatural coolness, though a strange, rhythmic sobbing can be heard echoing through the pipes. Arthur became the guardian of the cold flame, sacrificing his life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of frozen stasis, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from a man's hollow love. The tapestry of ash and iron, the stepmother's silent debt. In a secluded manor, nestled within the dense, mist-heavy forests of Cumbria, England, a modern family sought refuge from the chaos of London. Eleanor, a woman of cold elegance and a professional restorer of medieval textiles, had recently married into the family, becoming a stepmother to young Leo. For Eleanor, the world was a collection of patterns, threads, and the preservation of the past. She had no patience for the local folklore regarding the Hollow Weaver, a legend of a genie that traded warmth for eternity. She was a woman of logic and silken fibers until she discovered a hidden chamber behind the nursery's oak paneling. Inside lay an ancient, lead-weighted loom, its frame made of blackened iron and its threads glowing with a rhythmic, suffocating heat. The English evening was damp and biting, but inside the nursery, the atmosphere turned predatory. The air, which usually smelled of lavender and old wood, became instantly parched, thick with the acrid scent of ancient sulfur, charred cedar, and a metallic tang of blood that began to seep from the iron frame of the loom, staining the floorboards a steaming crimson. The digital humidity sensors in the room began to malfunction, flickering with fiery glyphs that defied any known programming language. This must be a chemical reaction caused by the oxidation of the lead weights, Eleanor muttered, though her lungs burned with every breath, as if she were inhaling invisible, glowing ash. But her eyes widened in absolute terror when she saw her stepson, Leo, standing by the loom. He wasn't crying. He was staring into the void. His shadow had detached from his feet, growing eyes of blue magma that pulsed with a hatred spanning 10 millennia. From the lead-bound weights, a dense, living mass of black smoke began to pour, a vortex of embers that coiled around the nursery's beams like glowing chains. From this darkness emerged an Ifrit, a genie of the scorched desert, whose essence had been bound to this loom by sorcerers centuries before the manor was built. The Ifrit did not seek to inhabit Eleanor's body, nor Leo's. Its presence was so cataclysmic that the stone walls of the manor began to warp and melt like wax. The genie's magic manifested as a network of burning threads that shot through the manor's foundation and into the very soil of the English countryside, connecting its essence to the life force of the surrounding forest. You thought your silken threads and leaden weights could suppress the original roar, little weaver of dust. The Ifrit's voice thundered, a vibration that shattered the porcelain dolls on the shelves. I do not need your flesh as a gate. This loom is my nervous system. I will transform every bond, every family tie, and every heart in this valley into a wick for my final bonfire. I will burn the world through the very love you used to bind it together. The Jinni began the Liturgy of the Severed Bond, a sorcery designed to transmute human emotion into physical, supernatural fire. However, the ending took a turn the Ifrit never anticipated. Eleanor, whose mind was trained to repair the most delicate of weaves and to calculate the tension of 1,000 threads, did not flee. In an act of pure will, she utilized her knowledge of structural reinforcement to redirect the entity's manifestation. Eleanor did not die, and she did not serve as a portal. She used her own consciousness to become a permanent weave. She projected her identity into the molecular structure of the iron loom, creating a logical knot where the Jinni was perpetually weaving its own imprisonment, unable to extend its flames beyond the frame. She did not cage the Jinni in her flesh. Instead, she turned herself into the final, unbreachable seal within the ancient machine. At dawn, the manor was found in absolute stillness. The loom was cold, its iron frame covered in a layer of silver frost that refused to melt in the morning sun. Eleanor had vanished. Leo was found safe, but he spoke of a new mother who lived inside the walls, keeping the air cool and the shadows still. Eleanor became the guardian of the loom, sacrificing her life to be the eternal seal that keeps the Ifrit in a state of suspended stasis. She remains there, in the silence of the iron threads, protecting the world from a fire that would have been born from the heart of a home.